So you were talking about, like the Pinot being, like here at certain price points, the Pinot here creams the French Pinot.
Well, it's just my opinion, but I think, the benchmark Pinot Noirs of the world are from Burgundy, but they only represent like 3% of the total production of Burgundy, and, it's the Grand Crus, and they cost $200 or $300 or $400 a bottle. They're very rare, very expensive. The next classification down in Burgundy is called Premier Crus. I don't know exactly the price range, but my point I was making is if you lined up 3 or 4 wines each from Burgundy and Oregon in that price range, $40 to $60 price range, I think we'd kill them.
Why is that?
That's a long story and matter of opinion. But a lot of it depends on what we're talking about, is weather. I mean, just the land that's available there, number one, for Grand Cru, is not as much as it is for the Premier Cru. They have more problems with weather, more problems with pests, and they're not as, they're more bound by tradition in how they do things. It's a good thing and a bad thing. It's good that they have the tradition. It's bad that they're bound by it.
So you think that's kind of limiting?
In some cases, yeah. They don't think outside the box very much, is my experience. But no question about it, that's the capital of Pinot Noir, and it's where the benchmarks come from. But increasingly, New World's, giving them a run. It's fun.
Yeah.
It's fun being the underdog.
Yeah. So how did you get into all this vineyard stuff?
Well, Ken Wright and I were roommates in college way back when.
Really?
And
where was that?
University of Kentucky, of all places.
Is that right?
Not known for its wine, better known for its fast women and beautiful horses.
And what were you studying?
I was in horticulture and had an interest in plant science and how man could influence different outcomes with plants. But it was started an undergraduate, just an interest in plant physiology and plant science and botany and natural sciences. And Ken started working in a fine restaurant, and we made the whole evolution together and tasting from Lancers and Matus. And when he started working at his restaurant, he started bringing home Beaujolais, or something that was a cut above, and we're like, wow, that's different than Lancers. And so we continued to taste, and for long we were given a class in the non-credit part of the university about, am I loud enough?
Oh yeah.
About wines of the world. We'd just read a book and go out and buy them, and then have people in to taste and talk about it. So we got bit by the bug together, but I could never figure out how to make a living at it. And so I sort of stayed in academia, got a master's, and then went to a PhD program down here at Oregon State in horticulture and plant nutrition. And all the while, as a sideline, studying about viticulture and about wines, until I found an opening here in Oregon in 1980. At then Knudsen Erath Winery. And so I jumped ship and took a job. And at the time, there was, I think, 1,000 acres in Oregon. And I took a job in charge of 100 of them. And it was pretty much trial by fire. For a long time, I told people I should have studied Spanish and mechanics. I'd have been better off. But as time passes, the academic background comes back. You marry practical experience with education, and then there's synergy.
Yeah.
Once you can mesh them, I think. And so good news was I got in on the ground floor. Bad news was there was a whole lot to learn in those early days.
And for everyone.
Yeah, you learn by making mistakes, and we made plenty of them.
Uh-huh.
But we learned from most of them. That's the beautiful thing about it is, in one generation of growing grapes in Oregon, we found out a lot of things. We found out Pinot Noir does pretty good. So does Chardonnay if you have the right clone. And we probably should have planted a little tighter spacing than they did in the very beginning. And along the way, we've learned about crop management and how to control the crop. Some of the early mistakes were allowing there to be too much crop not recognizing that there was too much crop and not doing anything to
Too much foliage.
No, crop meaning grapes. Too many grapes per plant or grapes per ton. Yeah, we made stabs at thinning in those days, but it just wasn't enough. And so when the dust settled, we still had too much.
And why do you thin?
To get the volume of grapes on a per plant basis or a per acre basis down to a range that we can ripen to our standards. The grapes just want to have baby grapes. And so if they sense that it's a terrible place to have babies because of the weather or because of their health, they'll abort and we'll have very low crop. But if they sense that it's sunny and everything's happy, they'll pour it on and have more babies. And that suits their purpose. They can have seeds and procreate. But if they react to their environment that way and put on too much grapes, that doesn't mean that we can ripen those to our standards. And so we have to recognize what they're doing and thin it down to a level that we can ripen up to standards. I mean, there's an inverse relationship between quantity and quality. So the more grapes there are per plant, the less thoroughly they ripen than if there's fewer.
Yeah.
And so there's some early disasters where we didn't recognize how heavy it was and didn't thin enough and had... There was one year, 84, when it was all we could do to get the grapes over 18% sugar. And you shoot for 22 or 23, and it was a fair disaster. About the only thing we could be done with it was make rosé or blush or something. It was
so that was a cold,
wet
October.
It started in September. Started raining in September and never quit. It was just a slog.
So run through what happens in the vineyard throughout the year? Pick a month and just month by month run through the vineyard, and also talk about things that happen in the vineyard. Talk about what you're seeing, what you're smelling in the vineyard, each month.
Okay. Well, remind me. I leave out the sights or smells. When as much as we've been growing. Like right now in November, we take advantage of this time to organize next year's plantings. And so we're putting in trellis. And this particular year, here it is November 8th or 9th, it's been dry enough in the past week that we were able to plant.
To do some planting.
Plant next year's plants this fall, and that way we don't have to store them. And a lot of the strategy is to take the highs and lows out of the work level. And because there's big spikes in this, and if you aren't planting, it's really a 10-month job. But if you are growing and planting, then we can take advantage of these lulls where there's nothing else going. And we keep people busy that way. People have to eat 12 months out of the year, even if there's not work 12 months out of the year.
Yeah.
So we've been, in other years, this time of year, it's too wet to get out and do that, but we just got lucky this year. And we start pruning around Thanksgiving. It's a little bit earlier than a lot of people do it, but it takes some skill, so we'd rather have fewer people doing it over a longer period. You get better quality control than if you wait. There's some advantages to waiting, and that is if there's a cold injury or frost or something, then you can sort of react to that a little bit. And there's even some wood rots that are more of a problem with early pruning, but on balance, we lean towards trying to mitigate those risks and having fewer people do it longer. So it's so we have 3 teams essentially. One of the more specialized people making the pruning cuts, and then just casual people that will pull the brush out of the trellis, and then another team that'll go through and tie the canes down to the wire. And so that takes all the way till March. When we start at Thanksgiving, it's a slow start. A lot of our guys have gone to work at Christmas trees or gone home to Mexico. And so we go from maybe having 200 people on the payroll during harvest for a 2-week period to having 20 the next. And it's like, screech! And, but we get little breaks like we're having this year. We appreciate it because it takes the heat off of next year. Then we also underline that we have a little nursery business where we take cuttings and we sell cuttings to commercial nurseries and even make our own plants. So during the same early winter time, we do that, so we know how many we have and put them in storage before it gets cold. Some years it's almost like a second harvest because California nurseries like Oregon wood, and they want so many flavors of so many cuttings of such and such flavor from such and such block, and it becomes almost like a harvest. So we have another little spike of activity around then in some years. You can tell when a recession's on because we don't get very many orders for that, but when we're in the boom part of the cycle, it gets busy.
And so is that hot, like those are in hot houses, or are they bare root and the temperature is...
Well, it's sort of like raw material for the purposes of grafting. So we just send it to them dormant, and they process it into grafted plants, whether it's in a greenhouse or direct rooting in the soil, if their choice. So we're just sort of raw material suppliers. And
so what you're doing is you're cutting the vine,
mm-hmm.
and then you're bundling them up,
yep.
and then
shipping them off.
Yeah.
But so there's a little bit of excitement in the winter, but not too much. Around February, all the old farmers would say February you get a 2-week break, because between November and February we may not get the tractors out in the field once. It's that wet, and there's a few things we could be doing if you got weather, but typically you don't. And typically we do get a little break in February, and by then everyone's pretty tired of manual labor and bad weather and getting a little grouchy and anxious to get out on the equipment and get caught up. So that's a bright period where you just go hammers and tongs, because you know it's February and you know that it's not going to last for very long, and there's all this work that's backed up because you haven't been able to get the tractors out for so long. And it's a big spike in activity, but come March or late February, you get back to the rain, and you sort of look forward to it because you've been working so hard. It's like, God, I'll be able to rest when it rains.
So what are the vines doing? Like in November, like after harvest, what are the vines doing? If they were a person, like a worker person, what would the vine be doing, like right after harvest?
They're going to sleep. They've been working hard, and so they're going dormant. In the metaphor of the human comparison, they're going to sleep. They're going into a rest period. Maybe there's a flush of root growth around the time of the first rains. When it's dry, they can't very well punch out the roots. But above ground, there's not much noticeable that's happening with the vines themselves. And outside of the activity associated with new plantings, we're not doing any work with them at all. There's nothing much to be done until we get started pruning. And so it all depends on the weather, but buds begin to break. The grapes, they begin to grow vegetatively before they flower. With some fruit trees like cherries, they'll flower before they begin to grow. The grapes grow vegetatively, and we call that bud break. The typical time is April 12. And the definition of bud break is 1 inch of growth in green, but it doesn't happen overnight. It's so cool in April that you can look out and it'd be 1/2 inch and almost green, and a week later it's 3/4 inch and kind of green. And but April 10 to 15 is the average time when we score it as bud break. And then as it warms up, it's a direct correlation with temperature. Anytime it warms up between late April, early May, they grow gangbusters. And the first job after they begin to grow is what we call suckering, and it's removing shoots that grow from the trunk and from unintended shoots. They just sort of send out volunteer shoots. And it's a big job. Go through and remove all those by hand. And then a little bit after that, we begin the foliage wires. These rows are close enough together that if you didn't force the foliage to go up vertically, like you see in your pictures, then they'd sprawl out and you couldn't walk through, much less drive through. So we have these wires on opposite sides of a row that we lift up as they continue to grow, and that forces them vertical. We have to make 3 or 4 passes through the vineyard to do that. And that goes from late May through July 4th or maybe a little bit later. But the big event is flowering, and that occurs June 15 or something like that. And we go out on what we call bloom patrols because it's like a birth date almost, or it's an important date to note because it's 100 days from bloom to maturity to harvest.
Wow!
And it's a general rule of thumb. And inevitably, I'll start getting calls late in the summer. When's harvest? And it drives me crazy because it really depends on weather just before harvest more than when bloom was. But that's as good an answer as I can give them as well. Bloom was on June 15th, so harvest will be September 28th or something like that. And so we go around all the different fields and try and make notes and sort of understand the season. Sometimes low elevations will go off and bloom all the way through, and then the weather will change and the high elevations will stall because the weather changed, and then resume later. So sometimes, most often, there's a division between low elevation and upper elevations. Some years not. Some years the weather's so good they all go through at the same time. So that's a good thing to know when you're going into harvest, and because as harvest approaches, you want to know what fields to check when, and so you can sort of know on the basis of bloom about that.
Now, what's it smell like?
Well, there's a sweet smell. The grape flowers aren't very showy. You really have to get in and look for them. But when you go in a vineyard for the purposes of establishing whether it's in bloom or not, you can smell it sometimes before you see it. Because to see it, you have to get down with your head in under the leaves sometimes in the morning light and really look around. But you just walk in and it's sweet smell. I don't know how to describe it any other than that. It's a sweet floral smell.
Like a rose or geranium or?
I'm not a good enough flower person to know what to compare it to, but it's specific and recognizable, and it's the same every year. And it's good. It makes you feel good when you smell it. And
is it the same for a Riesling as it is for a Pinot?
Mm-hmm. At my level of olfactory expertise, it is. But I think so. Yeah, I think it's. Maybe they could do some chemical analysis and establish that it's slightly different. But all this time, we're also spraying sulfur to control powdery mildew, and so that has a stink to it.
And you're already spraying that at bloom?
Yeah.
Wow.
We start even in May, but right around bloom, we try to avoid it. Sometimes it doesn't interfere with the aroma of bloom. Sometimes you get both of them. And
in bloom, do you need are they self-pollinating, or are they?
They don't need insects. They're sort of cross-pollinating. They're a complete flower, so they have the female part in the middle and male anthers around the outside, and they like supposedly to cross-pollinate from one flower to the next rather than self-pollinate.
So it could be from one vine to the next vine then?
Yeah, or one flower to the next.
Okay.
And so no bugs are needed, but it's a critical time because about my earlier story, that's when it's determined what percentage of flowers will turn into berries and what kind of season it'll be in terms of crop level and how many tons per acre or cases per acre.
And that's determined by like the number of flowers, or the flowers going to maturity?
It's determined by the percentage of flowers that turn into berries. And so, all this happens within a half-inch flower, maybe a quarter of an inch. So an eighth of an inch away from the receptive female part is a very sexy story. You have to get a male pollen over in a wind current over to where the female flower is welcoming. And then once that happens, this pollen has to germinate on this surface and then grow down a sperm tube, I think is a botanical term for it, and fertilize the egg. And that can happen or not. And if it doesn't happen because of weather or nutrition, then it just falls off. That's back to the story where if they sense it's a bad place to have babies, they just abort. They give it up. Because that process isn't completed of pollination and germination of the pollen and fertilization. But in good years, you can get that happening a lot, so that a high percentage of them will have that process be successful. And on top of that, you can have up to 3 or 4 pollinations per flower. In a berry, if you have 3 seeds, that means you had 3 fertilizations.
Is that right?
And there's a correlation between seed count and seed and berry weight, berry size.
So the more seeds, the bigger the size.
Yeah, and the bigger the weight. So when that gets multiplied zillions of times across an acre, makes a difference.
Yeah.
Some years, years like, well, going backwards, 04, 98, 94, 89, 88, 83. Those are all years where low percentage of flowers turned into berries. And it's a good thing for the consumer because that means our yields are going to be low. And it increases the likelihood that you'll get very thorough and complete ripening because the yields are low. It's not so good for the banker, but for the consumer standpoint, those are all great years where low percentage of flowers turn into berries. And then the opposite kind of year, well, 84 was maybe the first, 82 and 84 were the first years where we had a really high percentage of successful flowering and we had too many yields. And in both those years, we didn't get thinned down very much. But subsequently, looking backwards, 07 was that way, so was 06, 03, 02, 01. Were all years where we had to thin back, and in recent years we've gotten to be pretty good at it. It's better lucky to be smart than to be smart, but sometimes we get within 3%. It's like a green bean farmer looking out over 100 acres of green beans and saying, yes, sir, I think we're going to have 578 bushels. And we might come in with 571. And that's what I'd spend a lot of time doing during the summer is crop estimate, where we do just that, try and estimate. And people think I'm a little over the top about it. But when it comes down to short strokes, people use it at harvest time. All of a sudden, when it gets busy, okay, we're going to pick this field. How many tons are there? Because how many tons there are depends on what tank they put it in. Will it fit? Will it all fit in one tank? And they get a little unhappy when the tank's all full and you're still bringing in more grapes. And then the other people will say, well, how many empty containers do we need to pick that in? How many tons are there? Yeah. And then we'll say, well, how many people do we need to pick that field? How many tons are there? And if you have a higher yield than what's estimated, those mistakes compound over the course of a harvest.
Yeah.
The whole goal is to have the whole vineyard picked and every tank and barrel full. But the world isn't perfect. And sometimes you have the whole vineyard picked and every tank and barrel not full. And that's only, that's not as bad as the opposite of having everything full and more grapes to pick.
Yeah.
So we spend a lot of time massaging that. So we count clusters, go through all the fields and count clusters and come up with an average. And then there's a little trick the university came up with where you go out 50... The
University of Oregon or Davis?
Oregon State. Where you go out 50 days after bloom, which is another reason to know when bloom is. And you weigh the clusters then, and you double that, and that should be your final weight.
So at 50 days, well, that's interesting.
Because there's sort of a sigmoidal curve weight increase. From bloom, you're going up rapidly. And then at 50 days, for some reason, it flattens out for about 10 days. And then it goes back up. So if you're on the steep part of the curve, you don't know where on the steep part you are.
Yeah.
And but if you hit it at 50 to 60 days, you can double that. And it works when the clusters are sort of in the middle of the bell curve. When they're really, really heavy, they can more than double. And when they're really, really light, they may not quite double. And but so some years where we try to say, well, this is lighter than normal, it's going to have a 1.8 factor instead of a 2.0 factor.
Okay, so you're counting these clusters. What month is that you're doing that?
We count them in May, June. Okay. And then we weigh the clusters early August.
Okay.
And then we come up with a spreadsheet saying this is what we think there's going to be. And we distribute that to the winemakers. And if they're not off on holiday, we'll ask them, here's what we think we have. What do you want? And it becomes this whole discussion. And if they want something other than what we have, then there's a whole discussion about how to get to what they want.
Like thinning
and how much and when and what sort of technique. And it becomes a big wrangle a little bit. Sometimes we go out and after we've done the estimate, we'll take the winemaker out and say, well, our estimate says X. And they'll look at me and they'll say, well, it doesn't look like X. And I say, well,
just by looking at it.
Yeah, just by looking at it. And I'll look at it and, well, it doesn't to me either right here. And they'll say, this can't be X. It's fine. Leave it alone. And, okay, it's me. But then we get up to harvest, it really is X.
Oh.
And that happens. It happened some this year. And so we spend a lot of time on it. And,
okay, so that's the discussion with the winemaker and you, like to kind of determine what the harvest is going to be. When is that? That's like August?
Yeah, early August we start getting into numbers, and we don't finish it till the middle of August. But by then, in big thinning years, it's a big job. Several years we've spent more money on thinning than we did on harvest.
Wow!
Because the guys kind of have to think about how they thin, whereas during harvest you're just taking it all off. And so we're anxious to get going on it, and we're sort of done with our summer work by then, with the wires, and we're anxious to get on it, because if you don't get on it, maybe you don't finish till Labor Day. And
on it, like in thinning.
Thinning. We're anxious to get on it, because if you don't start early, you may not finish till Labor Day, and then the benefit of it diminishes if you do it too late. So we will send out the information to winemakers as we get it, even before it's all complete, to see if we can get some feedback from them about this field or that field. And typically they'll say, yeah, okay, that field, go ahead and get started. And some say, do what you think. Some want to come out and tell you how to do it. But they're the customers, and so vineyard guys pretty much have to just say, okay,
smile.
Smile. I had one winemaker at harvest. Two winemakers were getting grapes from one field, and I was showing them one in the morning, one in the afternoon, thinking about picking this field. And one guy in the morning said, "There's no flavor. There's just no flavor, Alan." I'm like, okay, yep, no flavor. The guy came out in the afternoon and go, "This is wonderful. This is wonderful. Let's pick it." Like, okay.
What'd you do?
Did what they said. But one of my tricks is this.
Well, wait a minute. You said that two winemakers from the same block.
In the same block. Two people buying grapes from different sizes.
Different rows.
Different rows.
Oh, okay.
And so the guy wanted to pick, we picked. The guy didn't want to pick, didn't pick. But I have a little trick during harvest. Winemakers will look to see what other winemakers are doing. It's a complicated decision. I'm glad that they make it and I don't. There's a lot of variables and it's hard. But they look to see what other people are doing. Are they picking? The voices start working. And what's going on there? What are they doing, Alan? And so I have a little trick where I'll call one up and I'll say, well, the guy next to you is picking on Friday, and we can get your stuff Friday too if you want. And they go, he's picking? Yeah. He's picking. Well, yeah, you might as well get mine then. And then I'll call the first guy up and say, second guy's getting his block on Friday. We can get yours on that day too. He's getting his? Yeah. You can get him in a fair lather if you work at it. It's fun.
And that's efficient for you, because then you can manage your teams efficiently.
Otherwise, you're just boomeranging like one of those pinball machines.
Yeah. Okay, so then harvest is
September 25, somewhere in there. Earliest we ever started was August 30, and the latest we ever started was probably October 20. But that was in the early days. 92 is when we started August 30. It was just hot. That's all you can say about it. But the years where we started really late was the years where we had too high a crop level and we just weren't ripe. So we left them. But generally 25, and my metaphor for it is like a big
your picking teams are kind of, into routines. And
no, we have to get casual people in, and it gets chaotic at that too. It depends on the weather. If you have good sunny weather and predictable picking schedules, and they know there's going to be a job the next day and the next day and the next day, they'll come back. But if you have spotty weather with rain, and the winemakers call you up and say, it's drizzling today, let's not pick. And all you can do is sometimes we'll pay them for an hour or two for showing up. You tell them, okay, we'll give you a call when we're ready to pick. Off they go to the next guy. And as there's more vineyards planted, it's more difficult. We have an advantage in that we have sparkling wine, and that gets picked early, so we get a rhythm going early. But if you can get in a rhythm, they'll keep coming back. But if the weather causes you to start and stop, it's an inertia thing. Starting takes some energy, and stopping takes some energy, really. But if you can just start and stay at it day in, day out, it doesn't have to be the same number of tons every day, but something to where you can give people a day's wage.
What about the vines? What's the vine thinking and doing like during this, right before harvest and during harvest? And
depends on the weather, as everything.
Like pretend like you're the vine, and you're a Pinot Noir vine, and you've got all this fruit hanging on your arms.
Well, again, they just want to have babies, and they don't care about wine. That's our problem. They're just reproducing. And, so that being said, there's the part that we make wine out of is nourishment to the seed, and so that's what their focus is. Number one. So they don't have the same standards as we do. We have to get up to 23, 24% sugar. They don't. That being said, I think the more crop level they have, the harder they're working. And science has sort of shown that the more demands that they have on them, the harder they are working to meet those demands, just like people are. And furthermore, depending on the weather, sometimes we get these east winds going, warm weather east winds. We had this happen this year, where it dehydrates them just suddenly. So, 2 or 3 days, you can go out and just see them raining before your eyes. And they're kind of screaming about that, like, give me some water. But on those nice 75-degree days when there's no east winds and they have a balanced crop level and the leaves are sitting there in the sun, they're singing. They're just like, yeah, they love it. And that's about as much as they think, I guess.
Yeah.
The rains, not very happy.
When it rains, the vine isn't very happy?
Well, I'm probably personifying it a little bit.
That's good.
Maybe they're happy because they're getting some water finally, because it gets really dry here in the summertime. And from a pure survival evolutionary standpoint, maybe they're happy to have a drink. But what happens is they soak up water, and it doesn't suit our purpose. 1 inch of rain is 27,000 gallons of water per acre. 1 inch of rain is 27,000 gallons.
And 1 inch is quite a bit of rain.
Well, we had 3 inches this year. But the point is, on a per acre basis, we've only got 450 gallons of wine. You're at 3 tons an acre.
I see where you're going.
So it doesn't take a whole lot of water from that 1 inch.
So you say like 450 gallons of wine per acre?
Yeah, if you have 3 tons an acre and 150 gallons a ton, that's average numbers, you get 450 gallons of wine. But 1 inch of rain is 27,000 gallons. So if you get an inch of rain, it gets down into the nooks and crannies of the clusters and dilutes them. They don't taste as good, so that's why I don't think they're as happy. But now that I think it through, I'm not as happy because they don't taste as good. It's watery.
Yeah.
And they gain weight. And they get water externally as well as internally up through the roots. And so they can gain 20% of their weight in a big rain event, which sort of throws their crop estimates off.
Holy cow.
It's a moving target. So they're very dynamic. And in this east wind situation, they're losing weight. If they begin to raise it, there it goes. But if it rains, they can put on weight and do one thing one week and another the next week. So it's really dynamic.
What, like right before harvest, you're walking through the vineyard. What do you see and smell?
You don't smell very much. What you see, which you like not to see, are random clusters that are behind in their development. Some that are still green when the others begin to be tasting okay, and you can begin to think, well, we could harvest these in 2 weeks, except for that one. It's still green, so you look for that.
Or a cluster that is like still some green on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We call them rosettas. They go from green to sort of rose color to dark purple, and so we call them rosettas. It's our attempt at Spanish. So we look for that. We look in rainy weather. We look for botrytis.
Botrytis. Explain botrytis.
Botrytis is a fruit mold. In strawberries, everyone sees it at the grocery store. It's a gray mold, and so it's a fungus that attacks sweet fruit. And we get it if we get the right conditions. And so we have to go out and patrol for that. Some years, other years, we don't even think about it because it's too dry. And increasingly, we're on the lookout for insect pests or any sort of problems.
What kind of insects?
We developed a bit of a spider mite attack in the past decade. Spider mite problem in the past decade.
On the leaves?
On the leaves, yeah, and they sort of turn the leaves bronze. So you look at anything that makes the leaves something other than green. And sometimes it can be mites, either Willamette mites, or there's another one now, rust mite, or even stress. And that's the time where you can find out if there's a zone within a larger block where the vines are behaving differently than the rest of the block. And the leaves can turn yellow from the stress. So particularly in, youngish vineyards, there may be a zone contained in a larger area that we didn't know when we planted it. It has shallow soils. And so we identify that, and we'll go back and we'll put 2 drip irrigation emitters for plant there instead of 1. Or we'll go back the next year and we'll remove all the grass competition. And we begin to sort of manage those, micromanage the subset type thing. So we look at leaf color, and we look a lot at balance, to be honest. And
balance?
Balance is sort of a generic, or it's a all-encompassing term, and it's not just during harvest, but it's all season long. Vines are sort of like people. They want enough of some things, but they don't get enough. If they have too much, they get out of balance. And so what grapes want are some stress, just like people want to have some challenge in their life. They want some stress, but not too much. They want some heat, but not too much. They want cool nights, but not too cool. They want a little bit of rain, but not too much. And so all that is manifest in an appearance of the leaves and the canopy that we look at to see if we can recognize what it is and if we like it, and if we don't, what we can do about it. And So irrigation is one obvious thing we can do immediately if it's too dry, or if they're too vigorous because they've had too much rain or not enough stress, then we can't do much about it then. But the next season we'll go back and put in more cover crop or that type thing. Or there's some areas that might have a nutritional problem. And so we spend a lot of time looking at that. We spend a lot of time sampling. The biggest decision is when do you pick grapes. So we don't smell very much. We see a lot in balance, but we taste a lot. Every morning for a month, it varies for breakfast. It's great. But we go out, we know from experience what are the earliest fields going to be, and we concentrate on those in the beginning. But we go out and sample them once a week to begin with, and as harvest gets closer, sometimes twice a week. And that involves walking up and down the rows with a plastic bag and taking berries. And then we bring it back to the lab and process it and taste it if we want and look at the color and analyze it. And it takes all day, really, to make the rounds and then to process it and then analyze the results and then talk about the results. It takes a better part of a day, and if you do that twice a week, that's 2 days out of the week when you're doing that. And so the drill is we'll do that once or twice a week, and then we'll get the weather forecast out and sort of massage it all and say, here's the plan. But we'll get it in 3 days, but let's go back out in 2 days and sample it again just to make sure. And it'll either stay on the schedule or it'll get bumped back. So that's all going on at the same time that we're talking to winemakers about are they happy with the crop level and communicating the results. I'm not sure we do a great job, but it's helpful to communicate with the people that are going to buy it, what you're seeing, and it's a lot of information to get to a lot of people sometimes,
and that's like by phone
or email
bringing it in,
phone or email or So it's a lot of communication.
Okay, so that's a year now. A year in the vineyard. Tell me about dirt. It's like these red hills that are just out the door over here are supposed to be incredible. So tell me about the dirt, the importance of dirt, and
well, the French, going back to their tradition, they learned over 1,000 years that patch of dirt is better than that patch. But in the New World, what we did is we took big 10 and 20 acre and bigger blocks and planted it all together, when in fact there's probably some subplots within that are better than others. The French have come to recognize dirt to a greater degree than we have. I think it'll take us another generation to come to some conclusions to the degree that they have.
Another generation of getting to know like the soil and what in one generation, what's there to be learned?
What was your original question, though?
Well, we're looking at dirt, and you were talking about how like the French is like up on the top of the hills the Grand Cru, and then it's a Premier, and then it's the the table.
Your first question was what makes the red dirt of Dundee so great?
Yeah.
And I went off talking about the French, but it's an empirical thing that people planted in Dundee and found out that it made. First guys came and planted in Dundee and thought it did pretty good, and so the second and third guys came too. And as we go along, there's other red dirt in the Yola Hills that does pretty good too. And so I think there's a couple things about it. One is it has clay, and I think that around the world, better wines come from soils that have a clay component. Why that is, I don't know. My own theory is it has to do with moisture relations, but that'd be complicated for me to explain because I don't quite understand it myself. So you have the local experience of it being good, and it's a good experience because as you come down Dundee's hills, you get into a different soil, just off the valley floor. In fact, it's different from France. In France, it's just off the valley floor. where the sweet spot is, the Grand Crus. But in Oregon, and particularly in Dundee, you get just up off the valley floor, and you get into a band of soils that experience has shown makes pretty good wine, but just the best examples come from the next jump up where the red begins to occur. And so we've had some experience where there were vineyards that had part of their blocks in the red soil and part of them in the lower soil just up off the valley floor.
Same block.
No different blocks, but same ownership, same parcel. And several people have those, including us. And most all of them say, it's not so bad down there low. The sweet stuff, the great stuff, comes from up into the red soil. So it's an empirical answer. And I think the experience around the world is that soils that have more clay somehow get better wine.
Okay. Talk a little bit about like different farming techniques. Like there's organic, there's traditional, there's biodynamic. It's like, what's your perspective?
Well, no one's for a bad environment, really. And we got involved in Live a couple, 3 years ago. We were kind of late to the party.
What's Live?
Live is an acronym for Low Input Viticulture and Enology. And it's a little misleading because vineyards are anything but low input. But they formed an association with a European group called the International Organization of Biological Control. And it's a movement closely aligned with the sustainable movement that represents a coalition of environmentalist growers and academics to come up with the best practice. So it's a science-based type of thing, whereas some of these others are sort of religious-based. I had some French guys come to visit once, and they asked me this question: "Are you so? What style are you? You organic? You biodynamic?" And I knew it was coming, and I said, I'm Baptist." And we got them pretty good. Because a lot of other stuff, in my view, having been trained in an agricultural university, is gobbledygook.
Yeah.
And so the organic people have some good points, and the sustainable movement that I'm associated with it is trying to take those good points and lose the dogma. But all that being said, is that it's been the whole conversation has been corrupted by marketing. It's very much on the front burner in everyone's marketing efforts, and so the term organic has been picked up by big-time national advertisers that organic is best. When if you look under the covers and examine the science, it's often not really. And so something I spend some time on too. I'm on the board of Live now, and decided if I can't beat them, join them. And so I've contributed some, having a science background. Contributed some to modifying the guidelines so that they make more sense. And, during my time, other people have joined as well, and it's starting to get some traction. And we organized a talk for the symposium, Oregon Wine Symposium, a couple of years ago, where we had an outside expert come and talk to us, and he said, you're cannibalizing yourselves in the marketplace. You're saying, buy my wine because I'm this, or buy my wine because I'm this. He said, you as Oregon run the risk of alienating consumers by confusing them. We, the industry, are the ones splitting hairs and making these distinctions amongst the various styles of viticulture. All the consumers want to know is, do you have a third-party endorsement of your practices that you're not a hillbilly? And I agree with that. I think the goal is to build a consensus on what the definition of sustainability is. And it's an emotional enough conversation. It may not be my lifetime that occurs, but if it doesn't, then I think he's right that we stand to confuse the consumer, because they'll go to some other region where it's a more unified message.
That's interesting. So what's it take? Like this area is known for the Pinot.
Mm-hmm.
What's it take to grow great Pinot?
Balance. A lot has to do with balance, about having some stress and not too much. And the growers, we argue about it all the time. Everyone agrees that a really stressed out vineyard isn't going to make great wine. And everyone agrees that one that's been overwatered and over-fertilized and grows and grows and grows isn't going to make great wine. But there's a lot of argument in between about what is the best balance. So balance is a big part of it, I think. There's been some big improvements in Oregon. In the beginning, this is part of a canned speech that I'm trying to apply. That's why my wheels are grinding. In the beginning, the Oregon role model was Napa, because it was 600 miles away. They spoke English and they took dollars. And so they modeled the vineyards, spacing in particular, and the clones, and the whole approach. They looked to Napa as a role model. It wasn't long. It was about the time I showed up. Some of the pioneers had taken a trip to France and came back scratching their head. And before I'd been to France. And so, you know what? Northern Europe really should have been a role model because it's on the same latitude and has similar climate. And so, with that recognition, there was this whole evolution towards tighter and tighter row spacing, and that's resulted in better wine quality.
Because
I think it's capturing more sunlight. If you're in a cool, low light area, the more leaves you have out capturing that light and heat, the more efficient your system is going to be.
Well, I'm not sure I understand. It's like the tighter the spacing is, like a 1 meter by 1 meter. I mean, that's pretty tight.
There's limits to it.
Tight spacing. It's like, and like the vines are like really close next to each other, and they're competing against each other, and
that's the next part of the answer. First part is you just have more leaf surface per acre capturing more heat and light. Yes, you're right. They are competing with each other, and that's a good thing, because when grapes are in this luxuriant environment, and this is a problem of these red soils and of Oregon in general, we have wet springs and wet winters, and the soils are really supercharged up to supply the vines with nutrient-rich environment, water plus nutrients. And if they're placed in this luxuriant environment, they'll grow and grow and grow and grow, and not put their energies into ripening soon enough to suit us.
Yeah.
So by planting them closer together, they begin to compete with each other, and they get this environmental message like, this isn't as luxuriant as we like it. We better stop growing and put our energies into fruiting. So that was one process of evolution that's resulted in our making better wine. A lot of this began to happen in the late 80s when Drouhin came. That was a breakthrough because they put in French-style spacing, and others modeled after them. About that time, phylloxera, first phylloxera finding was in 1990. One of the vineyards that we managed, it was a big panic. I had TV crews chasing me around. But it had a silver lining in that we began to graft on resistant rootstocks. And those resistant rootstocks tended to be less vigorous than own-rooted vines. And so that gave sort of a bump to quality also. And then when new clones were released, that was 1989. And so all this was sort of in a short time span. And some of it came from the French and from out of the area. And then, about that time, we began to get a handle on managing the crop levels and began to irrigate and maintaining that in X years out of 10, it's going to actually improve quality, maybe not every year. And so a combination of all those things, along with more experience, resulted in more consistency. Because in the early 80s, there'd be a flash of success and Oregon would get some attention. But the next year, it would go sideways and people would say, well, it's overrated, it's inconsistent. And everyone knew that rattled back to the vineyard, but we didn't quite know what to do, when, or how to do it.
Yeah.
And so it was a real evolution changing the techniques, improving the techniques that resulted in more consistency. And I think a higher plateau.
Tell me a little bit about clones now. It's like now, gosh, there's a whole array of just looking at, say, just Pinot. There's I don't know how many clones there are. Now, what's
well, Oregon's early successes were with the clones we had in the early '80s, and at least one of them was good. It was really just two of them. One of them was all-purpose and good clone if it was managed properly, and I pointed out how we did manage it properly in some instances. But it was responsible for some of the early successes.
And which clone?
It's called Pinot.
Pinot, yeah.
Then in the late, the pioneers sort of recognized that California clones, what's suitable for California might not be suitable for here. So they led the effort to get French clones introduced into the U.S. And since they did, they got introduced through Oregon State University, which was a bit of a coup that they didn't go to Cornell or to Davis, but because we'd been agitating for them, we got them. And since we were in Oregon, we were first to be able to buy them.
Uh-huh.
It was kind of an exciting time. And you could only buy 25 vines at a time. And but we took those 25 and took them to the nursery and turned them into 250, and took those 250 and turned them into 2,500. So at one point, we had the largest planting in America, just by virtue of having blown them up in the nursery.
Largest planting of Pinot?
Of clones.
Of clones.
French clones.
Of different kinds of clones. And these are like 777.
Mm-hmm. So we've had a lot of experience with them.
Uh-huh.
And the Pinot clones are, some are not as good as Pinot, it turns out, in my view. Some are as good, or in some years, maybe better. In any event, they're different in their flavor when it comes down to it. And so winemakers like them because it gives them more blending opportunities, more lottery tickets. They're just,
lottery tickets?
Yeah, they're just different. And maybe they blend together well, or maybe on a standalone basis, because one might bloom slightly different time and have different flowering or whatever. The point is that the original clone was good, and several of the new French clones are as good or better.
Uh-huh.
The Chardonnay clone that we had was terrible. It was just a mismatch. And the Dijon clones of Chardonnay were far superior to that. And we went, 10, 15 years making pretty bad Chardonnay in Oregon and earned a pretty bad reputation for it. And had we had these other clones in the beginning, probably wouldn't be having to work to overcome that bad reputation.
What about the rootstock now? It's like you put, there's vigorating and devigorating and different levels of, explain a little bit about how that rootstock works.
Well, rootstocks, first of all, are American in their origin, and they co-evolved with phylloxera so as to develop a tolerance to phylloxera. And they're native to different river valleys in the east and southeast. And so, I don't know, maybe there's 6 or 8 different raw American rootstocks that had tolerance to phylloxera. They didn't graft Pinot Noir very well. There was incompatibility problems, or there was some sort of other commercial problems associated with using them directly out of the woods. So they crossed them with other American ones. Did you know all that? So depending on where they evolved, some were in riverbanks and some were up.
And you say they came from the southwest,
southeast, Texas and Missouri, and
wow, huh?
I'm not sure where else. Arkansas, I'm not sure where else. But there was 4 or 5 or 6 species, pure species, that they found that didn't have any problems from phylloxera.
Huh.
And but they wouldn't grasp very well with Pinot Noir or other, so they crossed them to improve the compatibility.
Mm-hmm.
And so the differences in them reflect where they evolved, I think. So some tend to devigorate a little bit. Mm-hmm. Some tend to invigorate a little bit. It's the best answer I can give. But rootstock performance around the world is a little bit different. It's not consistent. It's not like planting a tomato plant in France and Britain and California and getting the same tomato plant. The weather in those places weathers and soils interact to make the performance sometimes very different, sometimes a little different. Not that I've traveled every vineyard in the world, but from reading the literature and comparing it to my experience, it's not quite the same.
So you could take the same, I forgot what some of the numbers are, but you could take the same, say, a devigorating rootstock and put it in, say, France, and it would give you a different kind of performance because of climate and of soil.
Maybe devigorating compared to what, but not to the same degree.
That's interesting.
Because it's an interaction of weather and plant material.
Yeah.
Almost everything is a function of environment and genetics.
Yeah.
And so there's different transections between, you have the same genetic in a different environment, and you'll get a different expression.
Yeah, that makes sense. Tell me an interesting story, something that, like how many, let's see, you've been doing vineyard since 1980. Mm-hmm. So you've been doing it for almost 30 years. Tell me like an interesting story that's happened to you in the vineyard.
Well, there's many.
I bet.
So a breakthrough moment when a lot of these improvements that I talked about clones, and spacing, and irrigation, and balance, we began working with in the early 90s, and doing new plantings, which took a couple of years to come into production. And then by the time they came into production, the weather was such that sort of mitigated any differences that we might have seen. It wasn't clear to us that we were going down the right track.
I mean, the weather, like the type of weather changed, like in the 80s and the early 90s. Well, actually, like
so suppose we planted some of these what were then experimental blocks in '94. It would have taken a couple, 3 years for that to come into production. So now we're up into '96. The weather in '97 was rainy, and so the differences between what we had high hopes for versus our older blocks wasn't very much. There was no conclusions to be drawn.
Yeah.
In '98, it was a poor set year. Yield was light. Everything ripened pretty well. And there was no conclusions to be drawn. Yet we kept chipping away at these then experimental blocks. Then in '99, the lights went on, and we began to see big differences. And it was like a 10-year wow. Like, this is going to work. And it was great. I mean, I just thought, where do you go from here? And it's too young and poor to retire, so I decided to stay at it. But, there was such a sense of accomplishment associated with it. I was like, wow.
The stuff that because like you had this hypotheses and you planted these plants, and then it took like,
10 years.
10 years for it
from germination to result was 10 years. And it wasn't like they were all my ideas, but I helped execute and implement a lot of them. And I was in the swirl of ideas about how to improve the viticulture in the area. And when I finally started to see it work, I was pretty proud.
What's been like maybe like the biggest disappointment, or like kind of like an oh shit moment, in the vineyard?
Well, personal one. I bought a vineyard in 1984. It was producing, and big leap financially, took every nickel, and it was a year where we had too many grapes and bad weather, and I contacted a man to buy my grapes during the summer when we thought it was all going to be cherry, and he thought that'd be a good idea. But there were so many grapes, all his barrels were full, and he couldn't take them. Couldn't take them. Because he was full of his stuff. And when you're out in the trenches looking at the birds eating your grapes and rotting and rain coming down, you're like, I don't know if this is such a good idea. So I'd planned a go to Europe that year for my first year. And I thought, well, we'll be done November 1, and I'll leave November 20. That'll give me time to study a few French books and come down to Earth. And just drug on and on and on and on. And I remember, I want to say it was November 10th. I hadn't picked any grapes.
Holy cow.
And it's raining. And I just sat down in the mud and cried. And I thought, this was a bad idea, Alan. And we got them picked. And in fact, I finished picking the day before my flight. It was an evening flight, and I had to work all day just cleaning things up and organizing things, and went straight to the airport and woke up on the Champs-Élysées. So one day I'm in the mud eating burritos with Mexicans, and the next day I'm on the Champs-Élysées for the first time in my life. It's like, it was fun. Jolts like that are what keep life fun. But I was, everyone talks about how Oregon growers cooperate, but there's been plenty of beneath the surface conflict. Keep that to myself, probably.
So why do you think that Oregon wine is so popular right now? Like, I had a dealing with an attorney in California, in Napa, California, actually, and he says, "Don't pay me cash, pay me in Oregon wine." So I thought, that's pretty interesting.
Well, I've always been a prophet of it. I dedicated a career to it because I think it's great. It's a balance. In fact, last night we were having wine with my girlfriend, and we decided to take a break from Oregon Pinot, and we tried a Australian red. And
like a Shiraz or something?
No, it was a Cabernet Merlot blend from Clare. Clare's known for its Riesling, but I've been to Clare, so I thought it'd be pretty good. And the other one was, I forget where, California. And it was with a crepe, but it was commercial wine. There's nothing wrong with it, no flaw. But it was, had this tannic finish that you expect with Cabernet. And it had a body weight that would have overpowered most anything. We were having it with crepes, so it was easy to overpower with that. We had that and thought, well, that was good. Let's try an Oregon Pinot. And the Oregon Pinot had more finesse with a lighter weight that complemented the food better. And I've always felt that. Why is the world learning about it? We always talk about sideways having an impact. Probably did.
Yeah.
But you'd like to think that you spend a career making something that people like. The marketing guys will finally figure it out and get it out to the world. Maybe, they finally got marketed.
Yeah.
It's a finesse grape grown in an area that achieves that finesse. And it's different. There's only three places. There's Burgundy, there's New Zealand, there's Oregon that grows wine of that finesse and elegance, I think. The best thing about Pinot Noir is you can get silk on the palate, sort of like velvet. It has length. You don't get that much with other varieties. But when you get it, it's like kissing a woman's skin. I mean, it just doesn't get any better than that. And you can get that here. You don't get it every year. You don't get it in every place here. But when you get it, it's the real deal. That's why I'm here.
We got to write a few of these things down because, What? Maybe one or two more questions, if I could. It's like just a real quick list of equipment that's needed out in the vineyard.
Well, tractor, obviously, and we have a fungicide sprayer to spray just fungicides. It has a different delivery system to spray on the leaves. And we have a herbicide sprayer that you don't want to cross-contaminate the two. And it has a different delivery system, lower horsepower requirement. So two sprayers. We have a hedger that trims the sides and the tops of the rows and keeps them kind of cultivated looking. In a perfect world, the grapes would grow just as much as you want them to and stop. But in fact, they often continue to grow. So we have to trim them up. And more, there's machines that will strip the leaves from around the clusters.
Machines.
There's different styles of them, but they're getting better and better. And so we have some of those that...
So you can do that on one side then?
We do it on one side early and then later do it on the other if we want.
So that the wind goes through?
And so mowers and rototillers and discs of different sizes. Tractors of different sizes. More and more there's equipment attachments for cultivating weeds in the vine row itself, so you don't have to use herbicides. We have a few of those. So that's the basics. They make pruning machines. We bought a couple of those, and they're sitting in the corner in the dust.
Pruning machines to...
They have machines, big machines that straddle the row and have these rollers that will either... It requires some hand touch-up after the fact, but
So they're pruning the vines then?
In the winter.
Holy cow!
Yeah.
How do they? I'd like to see how one of those works.
They are pretty wild. We've got these banks of cutters, and it's got wheels that are a bit wider than the cutters, and so when it hits a post, the wheels sense the post and bump out, and then come back. And the miracle is the wires that are going through there don't get all wrapped up, but they don't. And,
that's amazing.
Yeah. We bought some, but we don't use them very much. And of course, mechanical harvesters. Guys bought some this year for the first time. We've never,
have you used mechanical up here?
Never. I never have. I've seen it demoed, but never used them. They happen someday, but
Southern Oregon, I saw Melrose was using a mechanical, and then in Washington.
I think Evergreen bought one here, and a couple of grower type guys like me bought them so they could rent them out.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Last question is, I'm doing this calendar right now, and I'm looking for...
Not in our mail. Yours.
Sorry, is it?
No. I just got typical post office mail.
Okay, thanks.
90 days or 190 days?
No.
It's a court order. I'm doing this vineyard winery series of calendars. It's a lot like these here, and it's like I told him I'd put interesting kind of factoids in there. It's like, how many grapes does it take to make a bottle of wine? Things like that. And I was thinking, I need to ask Ellen, some things about, like the vineyard stuff that, is just. You said there was 450 gallons of wine per acre on a 3 ton per acre harvest. Something like that. It's like, like how deep are roots on a, say a 15-year vine, or, something that is just.
Well, one thing we play around with are pruning weights. We go out and weigh, prune some vines, and then weigh them, and then extrapolate that to the whole acre. And so, I don't know if this is interesting, but if you take the prunings plus the fruit, then you have biomass per acre. So we can get 10,000 pounds of biomass per acre if you weighed up all the cuttings and all the fruit. But I don't know if that's interesting.
That's fantastic.
People don't know what an acre is, really.
Well, I can put...
Acre's 210 by 210, but you almost have to relate that to the backyard.
Well, that's what I'd say. Like it's, I can't remember what it is in relation, say, to a football field or something like that. How many football fields fit into an acre? But relate it to something. That's a great. So that the biomass, and that's like the fruit and prunings, not including the vines themselves, like the
trunks,
the trunk and the roots and stuff.
So that's every year they put out.
Wow.
Sometimes 10,000 pounds a year, and it takes about 250 man-hours per acre per year. That's a good one.
250
man-hours per year per acre. It's a lot of work.
So I'm trying to translate that into a vine, but boy, that's so hard. That depends on the spacing and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, it could be
So like
not so hard.
Okay.
That's only 0.1 hour, 6 minutes. per vine.
6 minutes per vine.
We translate. Yeah.
Boy, that 250 man hours.
250 hours. No, point. Okay, 250 divided by 2,000 plants
Okay.
would be 0.12 hour. So that's 6-7 minutes.
Huh.
You do it another way, 250 times 60 to get to minutes. Seven and a half minutes per vine, but just that many vines adds up.
Yeah. Well, actually, when you think about it, though, 7.5 minutes is like how long does it take to prune a vine? Like, to harvest doesn't take that long, but to prune it takes a little bit longer.
It's, maybe 30 seconds. We might do, we wouldn't do 15 passes, but suppose it was 10 passes. It took 30 to 45 seconds each.
To prune it.
Prune, pull, sucker, do all thin. If you had 10 passes a year, and some of those were 30 seconds, and some were 45 seconds, you'd be close to 7 minutes.
Huh. And like per vine, what do you think it takes to harvest like one vine?
Time?
Yeah.
I have that in my head. Probably a third of that.
So about
Quarter of that. Say 2 minutes. 2 minutes to harvest a vine.
2 minutes to harvest a vine?
That's what, Mexicans doing it.
To harvest one vine? 2 minutes? That long?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it's a lot fast. I used to pick grapes, but it was a whole different thing. It's like they're so easy to pick.
Okay, maybe
now.
it's a minute.
Yeah, huh. Okay. Yeah, these are great. If you think of other stuff, like, as you're just going to sleep, it's like I've got to come up with 78 of these things.
I have all kinds of them.
Yeah, I mean, this stuff is great. Like that biomass, like the 10,000 pounds per acre is, that's substantial.
Yeah.
Like every year that they're outputting. I mean, that's a lot of weight.
It is.
I mean, that's 5 tons. 5 tons. I mean, that's more than the weight of an SUV.
I know. On a little acre. Every
Yeah.
year.
Holy cow.
I'm not sure it's that much in other parts of the world, but here it is. And it speaks to, if you took a cross-section of the soil and all the water and nutrients that are in that cross-section of soil on April 15th, that's a lot of energy that goes up every year.
God, that's phenomenal.
And I'll tell you, I don't know if this will fit, but I'll show you. So if you take an acre here, and these rows are 7 feet apart, and plants are 5 feet apart. Okay. Take another acre here, and these rows are 5 feet apart, and plants are a meter apart.
Okay.
And this has 2,600 vines an acre, and this has 1,250. And then if you took a cross-section of the soil, and put that acre on that top of that chunk of soil, and then you measured the biomass, and then you took that off and you put that one on and let it grow up, and you measured biomass. What would be more or less of the same? What would you expect?
Boy, the part that has studied physics a lot would say it's pretty much the same.
It is the same.
Yeah.
And because
that's interesting.
It's got all this energy down here, and it's just up to us to decide how we want to display that energy. So we want to display that every 5 rows, every 7 rows, every 10 rows. It's going to come. It's like kinetic energy. Is that the term for it?
I don't know if that's kinetic energy. That's like movement and stuff like that. But that's really interesting.
Not many people in the Oregon wine business know that, and we only do because we go out and weigh it.
Shoot. Can I tear that off and
Yeah.
put it here? That is really, that's interesting. Well, this is fun talking with you.